Welcome to Volya Radio. Slava Ukraini.
Okie dokie. Hello, everybody, or at least Regina. Hi. I will give it a couple of minutes for people to pop on in. I'm also waiting for Peter. I think you can cancel that last co-host invite you sent me because I seem to have one. I've got one outstanding as well. I think I just got two. So not to worry about that one. And we'll just give it a minute for some people to pop in. Let me do a timestamp while we're thinking about it. So, timestamp, we are 7 p.m. in the UK. That will be 9 p.m. in Ukraine and 2 p.m. Eastern. I always get that one wrong. So I apologise if I got that one wrong. Never mind. So I'm going to have to give you a bit of a long intro because our friend Peter Hedderly is currently driving home. Because guess what? Caught up doing some train stuff. Yeah, I know. Train nerd, typical. So yeah, he sent me a message going, oh damn, I'm running late. I was like, yeah, don't worry about it. So I'll give you a little bit of an intro. What is the intro? Well, we're just going to recap what's been happening with trains over the last week. And Peter's going to give his opinion on a few things because what has been happening with trains over the last week is that Ukraine seems to have taken a particular dislike to all of them that are going into Crimea. And a number of them going in other directions. I mean, just looking at what Ukraine's been up to, they appear to, have just taken a particular dislike to train logistics. And, oh, look, here he is. I got problems. With my co-host. Right, let's see if it'll let me... No, right, okay. So, just to let you know, host phone owner, that you are going to have to bring Peter up because I can't. Because your first co-host invite seems to have taken. I look like a co-host, but I have no functions. So if you can sort Peter out, and then I'll have to recycle. Love this app. So yeah, I just, as well as taking out bridges, rail bridges, and all the like have been taken out. Now, I also have another person requesting, and they're okay. They don't need to come up. Thanks very much. Hi, Peter. How's it going? Can you hear? Can you speak?
I can. It's going well. I am just literally approaching my home. I got a bit delayed, but I will be there, and I'm on hands-free in case anybody is wondering. So I will be with you fully concentrating very soon. But in principle, yeah, a lot of stuff has happened. So much has happened within the last 2 weeks. Or a week or so, it's difficult to know what to talk about, and a lot of it's not to do with trains, but we'll try and keep to trains and railways and logistics, and that's the sort of that's where I think things are going to hot up a lot, or rather are already hotting up, as well as, of course, in the skies over Moscow, and I think both of these things will come together and put a lot of pressure on the Kremlin, and they are going to find themselves, I think, in a worse and worse position, because these things are sort of cumulative. And once you knock one set of logistics points out, you can then go on to the next bit forward, and you progress, and it becomes a sort of an ongoing thing. And Ukrainians have clearly got the range to be able to interdict the highway to Crimea, and also now a lot of the bridges and effectively the entire railway in Crimea, which is, to all intents and purposes, has now been knocked out. They were having to terminate everything at Kerch very recently because the multiple bridges and parts of the railway had been destroyed from there, and there's no alternative diversionary route or anything. You can't get around it because there is only one railway there. And it looks like last night they've hammered Kerch as well, so I wouldn't guarantee you'll even get that far for very long. So there we are.
Well, I can't even close my mic at the moment, so let me know when you're ready, Peter, and I'll go and recycle. But in the meantime, let me just quickly give you a wee recap, which is, yeah, sorry, I'm still about to scream. So last Sunday, I just sent, Peter, a little bit of information about one of my favourite places, Smolensk. Because there was local sources reported an attack on the railway infrastructure there at Vyazma. That's what I'm going with. And apparently, this was particularly interesting. It's the voltage changeover point on the main line from Moscow to Minsk. And if they were ever going to go to Berlin, this would be the line that they would have to choose. And guess what? That they won't be doing that ever. So I think we can safely say that they're probably not going to go charging off to Berlin. But yes, the Moscow to Minsk line. Now, considering how much they're using fuel and other additional services from Belarus, I would imagine that this is a particularly good place to get hit. Wouldn't you think, Peter?
Yeah, that's exactly the point. As we know, and I think I've seen somewhere else, fuel imports from Belarus and Kazakhstan, other places, into Russia have shot up massively since, in the last 6 to 12 months. But I think from Belarus, it was a ridiculous amount. It was like 200 or 300% more than they normally transport. So there will be a lot of stuff, and I'm sure military stuff as well as fuel coming in through Smolensk and through Vyazma to Moscow and onwards. The Russian Railways has two types of overhead electrification. The older direct current voltage, which is 3000 volts DC, which is ostensibly pre-Second World War, and some other places where they've extended it, where it sort of connects to the existing network. And then more modern electrification after the 1950s has been at 25 kilovolts AC, which is a fairly sort of standard form of electrification, more modern and more efficient because you don't need so many substations. And there are some points where the network sort of changes from one to the other, like the Trans-Siberian. There are several points where it changes from AC to DC and back again, based on when it was electrified. And once you electrify it at one voltage, it's quite difficult to then change it. So Vyazma happens to be the point where it's about something like 90, 100 kilometers east of Moscow, at a rough guess, on the way towards Minsk due west. And at that point, the old DC voltage runs out and more modern electrification takes over. But the point of that is there'll be a lot of gubbins and a lot of technical stuff and sort of transformer stations and what have you. All of these things make quite good targets. And although once they're hit, they might have some success in getting them back up and running again. It's where resources are stretched and they've got all these other things that they're working on. So one more thing going bang just overloads the system and will cause them a lot of trouble. So I certainly hope that is the case, and that again will have been chosen quite strategically by the Ukrainians, because they will know how much traffic is coming in from Belarus into Russia, and particularly oil and refined oil and jet fuel and all that kind of stuff. and that this is now going to get even more critical with what's happened in Moscow, because that's going to place everything under huge strain. And we're already seeing fuel rationing and fuel queues in Moscow. And I think it's going to get a lot worse, because it's quite clear that that oil refinery in Moscow isn't going to go back online anytime soon. It produces a lot of oil straight into an oil ring that goes all the way around Moscow, feeds the airports, and I think we're going to find it's going to be quite a very interesting few weeks ahead. Watch this space, big googly eyes, and go out and buy popcorn, because I think the Russians have now got themselves into the situation where they're probably not going to be able to recover this. Um, another interesting thing happened a night or two ago, where drones reached Tyumen refinery. That is way beyond Yekaterinburg, actually across the Urals and into Siberia, which is beyond there, something like 2,000, possibly even 2,500 miles as you fly from the front line. And that is going to have, I think it should have Putin quaking in his boots, because it's only another 800 kilometers to Omsk, which is the largest Russian oil refinery, and the Tyumen one is pretty significant as well. It's the sort of central point of a whole load of oil activity in Tyumen Oblast, and that's, again, this is all going to really exacerbate what is already a pretty dire situation for them. And I think Budanov in his room in Kiev will be having a wry smile on his face, because success like that is quite sweet when the Ukrainians have had to endure everything they've had to endure in the last 4 years, and things finally seem to be coming together and moving, as I've said, I think decisively in Ukraine's favour, because I don't think there's any way the Russians are going to get back from this. But we do have to be not be complacent, because they will try to copy what the Ukrainians are doing, and they will try and out-produce them. But let's just hope that the Ukrainians can always stay 1 or 2 steps ahead, and I hope they will. And yeah, I think that's where we've got to now, and just wait and see what happens in the next few weeks. Could be very interesting.
It could well be, yes. And I'm sorry, I can't close my mic, so I'm just trying to be very quiet while you're talking. But this is how you behave when you can't close your mic. You're quiet. You don't click. You don't chew. You don't rustle. Just saying for those listening. Sorry, it's a massive bugbear of mine for someone to keep their mic open while someone else is talking, and so I'm really trying to be good. But also, what was I going to say? Oh yeah, I think probably Magyar and Budanov probably have cracked a wry smile over the last week or so because of everything that's going on. I know that's shocking to hear, but I think they probably have. Lexicon, you popped up on the panel there. I couldn't bring you up, I'm sorry. But did you want to add something at this point?
No, I just, well, yeah, take a breath. I just am really thrilled to see Peter go all the way with this analysis, because I've heard so many old experts there saying, well, we'll just have to see. But this guy Yuri Sheptitsky, this old professor of American and Russian history, saying, well, no, yes, well, Crimea is lost, but so that means that people can't go and have picnics there or anything. And so they can, they can negotiate about it for years and years, and maybe someday it'll go back to Ukraine. All these characters, what's the opposite of a wag? All these sages telling you that it will take forever, or that okay, we'll see if Ukraine can hold this, and so on. So I really appreciate it, Peter, hearing you say, I don't see how Russia can come back from this. And I also think hitting Moscow and Crimea at once is so spectacular for all the news agencies. So BBC has to talk about it, and Fox News had like a 10-minute report all about this and how Ukraine is now winning the war, etc. So the psychological effect of this is phenomenal. So great to hear you guys. Thank you.
No problem, Lexi. And yes, you're absolutely right. It takes a lot to force something into the news cycle these days from Ukraine, doesn't it? So they do have to do something pretty spectacular to even be noticed. And well, you know, Ukraine likes to be noticed. You mentioned Belarus there, Peter, and I just want to point out that Zelensky himself also talked about Belarus this week, giving them, 7 days to remove any of that equipment off the border there, which is essential in helping Russia with their targeting, because he's had enough of that nonsense. Also, he pointed out that it's not just fuel that Belarus is supplying Russia with. It's all sorts of other things. He mentioned munitions factories and other production that was helping them to build bombs and missiles. And he basically said, you're on a warning, dude. And isn't it refreshing to see Zelensky totally change his tone now? He's the person who's calling the shots. And, the Ukraine have been able to build themselves up to such a position that he can turn around and say to Lukashenko, you better stop that, otherwise you're going to get yourself into trouble. Don't you think? I might have to wait for him now. He's probably getting in the car. Getting out of the car, sorry. Go on. Whatever. He's reconnecting. I knew this would happen as soon as he got home, and this is why I did not go and recycle earlier, because I knew as soon as he went from one connection to the other, he was going to get dropped. So, yeah, basically, I think that this is brilliant, that Zelensky is able to command, as it were, what's going to happen from now on, because he's got the armed forces doing such incredible stuff. He can say, right, you better stop messing about. You better find yourself something else to be busy with, other than, helping my countrymen die, basically. And I'll just tell the host, excuse me, Mr. Host Phone, Peter's back. Thank you very much. Thank you. Poor host phone guy. He's like, "Oh, I thought I was just going to start this and leave them to it. Sorry about that. Thank you. So, yeah, Zelensky is sort of finding his inner bully, shall we say, because it's been a while since he was able to actually just say, actually, no, we're not having any of that. Don't be doing that. He's had to, be gentle and diplomatic and genuflect to people, which have been, in my eyes, a little bit beneath him, considering he's trying to save his flipping country. And he's in this position where he's got to sort of bow and scrape and be nice to people who are half the time assholes who are trying to tell him what to do. And now he's in a position where actually, we have strength. We have the ability to call the shots. And I'm really enjoying this sort of newfound confidence that he's got. How you doing, Peter? Are you back with us?
I am. Yeah, sorry,
Yay.
I dropped out when I was transferring in from my car to home, but now I'm home and all good. Sorry, apologies, everyone. I thought I would be back earlier, but I got delayed doing an errand and was just running on my way back. Anyway, I am back home and all good now, so shouldn't be any
That's
more
okay.
disruptions, hopefully, and hopefully the tech will be stable and we can carry on. So, yeah, I think what you're saying about Zelensky, absolutely, he's the guy is incredible. To be put in that position, the position is bad enough that he's found himself in, and then people who should be supporting him, and in some cases, like the US and the UK, have a treaty obligation under the Budapest Memorandum to support him, have not done and have effectively undermined him and played double agents in effect, is just an absolute disgrace. And the guy has infinite patience and tolerance, and none of us thought really, when you had a comedian elected to presidential office, that this guy was going to turn out to have the sort of mettle that he has. Absolutely incredible and astonishing, and I think, to my mind, he's head and shoulders above anyone else, and politically. And I hope his country will. I think the people in his country do recognise that, even those who didn't support him at the outset. But he is quite. The leadership is just astonishing, and admirable, and a complete role model for other leaders who are falling quite a way short of what he's achieving. I better not say too much more than that. And it looks like Mockers is now recycling, so hopefully we'll have her back shortly. Over the past week, it's been just so incredible that it is difficult to know where to start with what's happened in Moscow, and then latterly now in Tyumen as well. So far from Ukraine, well into Siberia. That is astonishing. When Yekaterinburg and Chelyabinsk came under drone attack, I thought, wow. This is beyond wow. This is another several hundred kilometers, and it really puts all of industrialized Russia, pretty much, and almost the entire population. What you need to understand about Russia is nearly all the industry and all the people are in the western end, and out in Siberia there's really very little. So now 80% of the Russian population in effect is within drone range, and that the population means all the industry and a lot of the military facilities, etc. And pretty soon, one would assume they're going to be within missile range as well, because the Ukrainians, the next thing they're doing are developing these missiles. There we go. But we're going to have a look at the sort of logistics and the reasons why this is so significant to Russia. And this is largely tied in. This is why this is so significant, or is so significant is the wrong word, is so critical and so going to be so disastrous for the Russians. And this is tied into the railways because of the distances and the fact the roads are pretty poor in Russia, and everything is very state run and top down, top heavy, command orientated. It's not like a sort of British economy where nearly all of the freight is on the roads and it's all private companies competing with each other, and sort of innovating and doing the job as best they can. It's just a top-down military sort of order kind of things, and because things go on the railway, because that's the easiest and cheapest way of doing things at volume, that's how Russia is sort of effectively geared up. And the result of that is that that's fine when it works, but when it doesn't work, and when spanners go in the works, and there's a lot of spanners flying around, things start to fall apart. And I would like to have thought they would have fallen apart much quicker. They haven't. The Russians have been incredibly good at keeping the show on the road, as it were. But there is going to come a point where there's going to be a collapse, just like the Soviet Union. Nobody really saw it coming when it happened, and when it happened very suddenly, almost overnight. Gorbachev was in his holiday, bizarrely in Crimea, I think, wasn't it? And suddenly found that these five wacky clowns had done a coup in Moscow, and the whole edifice just came falling down. But it had been under sustained pressure over many years, largely for the Afghanistan war, and also on economic grounds, because oil prices had come down, and the Soviet Union was just unsustainable. And I think that is a very similar situation with the Russian Federation now. In fact, we are several leagues beyond where the Soviet Union ever got to, in my view, which is why I'm surprised the Russian Federation hasn't collapsed sooner. But I think it's inevitable, and it's fundamentally for the same reasons the Soviet Union collapsed. They're trying to reinvent it, and they'll just get the same outcome. And from a logistics point of view, they have had now almost 12 years under sanctions. Those sanctions have had different effects, but they have been effective, and the railways certainly have not been able to get supplies of basic things like ball bearings, have traded down for Chinese substitutes. One of the things about running a railway is there's a lot of friction, there's a lot of wear and tear, and there's a lot of maintenance required. And if you start to skip on your maintenance, you build up a backlog, and there comes a point where it just gets unworkable. And we've seen more recently partisans, Black Spark, etc., within Russia knocking out locomotives here, there, and everywhere. No one of these is going to have a sort of significant effect, but when you add them all up together, and the maintenance backlog, and the fact there's half their maintenance engineers have been drafted off to the front, etc., etc., you end up with a situation that's just unsustainable, and they won't be able to go on forever. So that's the kind of background. And anything specific you want to pick up on, Mockers, or should we carry on just like in sort of general discussion?
Well, we had a little chat, didn't we, about Debaltsev? Is that the place, Debaltsev, in the Donetsk region? That the railway infrastructure there last Monday was apparently reported to be on fire, and you'd actually visited that place. And I showed you a picture with firms, couple of firm squares on it, and you were like, I've got a picture of that station. Hang on. And you dug it out to show me. Probably doesn't look like that anymore, does it, Peter?
I doubt that it does. Yeah, Debaltseve. This is a quite a key railway junction, effectively just outside of Donetsk, where the line to Donetsk and Luhansk diverge. So it's a junction where you can either go towards Luhansk or Donetsk. I went there in about 2009. I think it's the only time I've been there. Jumped off a Kiev Donetsk train, and there wasn't a train onto Luhansk, so I actually went by road to Luhansk. And then jumped on another train there from Luhansk towards Moscow. In those days, over the border was open around a sort of what's a back road through Starobilsk, which is where a lot of the stuff is going on at the moment, and things are going boom, and across the border at Valyuki, Stary Oskol, and up towards Moscow, which is one of the key railway supply lines down from Moscow at the moment. Debaltsevo was quite famous because that was the place where a load of Ukrainians were in 2014-15, I think, had an agreed corridor to get back from Ilovaisk, which is the Russian border in Donetsk Oblast, and they came back into Donetsk and had been told they had a green corridor to get through, and the Russians just massacred them, about I think 300 or so Ukrainian military, just completely in cold blood, blatantly lying, saying that they've agreed one thing and then just killing them. And this is where a lot of the trust is gone. So Debaltsevo is a railway junction, and therefore it is a sort of key hub. It's a hub for the Russian military, where stuff will be coming in by rail from Russia, and probably that is the point at which it probably won't go much further by rail. It'll then carry on by road to the front lines, which are only about somewhere about between 50 and 100 kilometres away. It might go a bit further forward by rail, but it'll be one of the key sort of forward logistics points towards the front lines, where things are sorted and sort of sent forward to where they're needed. So it's quite a key place to be targeted. And really across the whole way across the land corridor, which is a road from Mariupol through Berdyansk, and then it goes up towards Melitopol because there's a sort of river inlet, and then down towards Chonhar across the estuary into the peninsula of Crimea. And there never was a railway along there from Berdyansk to Melitopol, but it appears the Russians in the last few years have built a railway quite hastily, which will be a sort of quite rough and ready thing, but it will allow them to get supplies through. There is a railway, but it goes way further north to Tokmak and Melitopol, and it is too near the Ukrainian front lines to have been usable, and had been put out of use quite a long time ago. So I think the Russians had built their own railway further south, and that has now been put out of use along with the highway. So it means now that the only way Russians can get stuff into Crimea is over the Kerch Bridge again, either the road bridge or the rail bridge, or by ferry there. And it turns out another train ferry was hit, I think, in the last couple of days, one that the Russians had bought from the Greeks, who heaven knows where. It was explained where it had come from. I wasn't particularly aware that the Greeks had train ferries, but because there are certain parts of the network that are on Peloponnese Islands and that, but historically I don't think they've had train ferries. But obviously they did have one, and they managed to sell it to the Russians. Well, the Russians managed to buy it, not very helpful, but that's been knocked out as well, and that'll again this will all put them under great pressure. And as we saw, I think last night or the night before last, I forget which, both Kerch and Taman on both sides of the Kerch Strait were hit with more oil tanks going boom and the port facilities and what have you. So again, this is just going to make it more difficult. And the Crimean bridge again closed. And I think it's becoming pretty clear that now, with a lot of the infrastructure destroyed further into Crimea, there's no point in knocking the bridges when it's all knocked out, and if they get them repaired, then they'll knock them out again. But the drones can just go further towards Russia, towards Kerch, Taman, and across the bridge and over into Russia. And I think we're going to see that, and the Russians are just going to get treated further and further back and become more and more on the defensive. And this means that they just cannot get their supplies to the front line. And what the railways and the army need is diesel, critically. I'm not at all up on which refineries produce diesel and which produce kerosene and oil and stuff like that. I know the Moscow one certainly does produce a lot of aviation fuel, and it is on the ring directly to the airport. So that I would expect that to start to have very severe consequences very soon. But the Ukrainians will probably have a much better idea, and I think Wheel Feel has an idea of which refineries produce diesel, which produce the various grades of oil, and I think that there will be some sort of strategic targeting on that. The largest refinery of all is the one in Omsk. I forget, it's about 15 million barrels. I can't remember now, but anyway, I think it's the largest. I'm pretty sure it is, and they're now within sight of that. Tyumen is only about, I actually could have looked up the exact figure, but it's only about within something like 500, 800 kilometres of Omsk. So if they can get to Tyumen, it isn't going to need too much of a range extension for them to be able to get to Omsk, hopefully in the fairly near future. Sorry, you've got your hands up again, Mockers. I'm rambling on too much.
It's all right. It's just, me, I like to try and keep things in a chronological order so that we can sort of just, go through the systematic dismantling that Ukraine have been doing for the last couple of, the last week. So basically on Thursday, I think last Thursday, I noted that in occupied Crimea, the Crimean Wind Channel was reporting that Ukrainian drones had started to really target the railroad infrastructure. So Vladyslavivka, perhaps, Vivka, showed a thermal anomaly, one of them, on the railroad spur line between that location and Fedosia. south of Vladyslavivka. There is a railway bridge. Do you mind, Kat? Thank you. There is a railway bridge over what appears to be a drainage ditch or a waterway that's empty at that exact location. So this does appear to have been one of the key railway and road bridge junctions into occupied Crimea. And it says here, slams into the bridge, local sources reporting that traffic was paralysed on the Kerch to Dzhankoy railway line. And this was sort of like the main start of it. I mean, Dzhankoy's been taking some hits for a couple of weeks now, but I think this was like, oh, by the way, you're not going to be using that rail line anymore. No, you're not. So I sent you that one, and you were like, "Ooh, I think we might have to have another space. You know, I think we might have to have a little chat about this." Because that particular one, you said was, as far as you could remember, was the only rail route from Kerch Bridge to mainland Crimea. Is that right?
Sorry about that. Vladyslavivka is the junction between Dzhankoy and Kerch. So as I've said previously, the Crimean rail network is basically like an X, with Dzhankoy in the middle of the X. So if you want to go anywhere on Crimea, you basically have to go through Dzhankoy. So if you want to go from Kerch to Simferopol or Sevastopol, you have to go up to Dzhankoy and then down the bottom leg of the X to Simferopol and Sevastopol. And if you want to go from Kerch to Armyansk, you have to go straight across the X through Dzhankoy at the middle, right the way to the top opposite X, opposite leg of the X. And if you want to go to Melitopol via it's actually Chonha or Sviash bridge, then you go to the middle of the X at Dzhankoy and then turn right and to the top right of the X. And then at the bottom of the X towards the Kerch Bridge, so the right-hand bottom leg of the X, there's a little branch line off to Feodosia, which is quite important because Feodosia is where the huge oil storage is on Crimea that's been bonked several times now, and the junction is called Vladyslavivka, and it goes off towards Feodosia. So if you knock out Vladyslavivka, you knock out not only the being a junction, you knock out not only the Kerch to Dzhankoy line, but you also knock out the branch to Feodosia, and again that's all the oil transport coming through from there. So what we ought to do is try and put a map of the Crimean rail network in the nest, which I will try and do because I did save one the other day, so I'll try and dig that up and then forward it, or try and put it in the nest myself. I'm not very good at doing that, but I'll give it a try.
Yeah, I can't actually put anything into the nest, but I can find you a map and give it to someone in the background to put in the nest. It's so sad, isn't it? This how nothing works for me. I love this app. I really love this app. It's amazing. One of these days, things will actually work, and I'll be so impressed and so shocked I'll not be able to speak. But where was I? Oh yes. So I've got a nice map here provided by Intel Schizo, and I will pop it into the back and ask one of our helpers to do that. One of the elves. So basically, that's all the passenger and freight trains out until they fix that bridge. Is that what you're telling me?
Pretty much yes, because the passenger and the freight trains use the same tracks, and the thing about the network being an X is that there's no diversionary routes. You can't sort of get around a blockage. So the rail network on Crimea is very susceptible to being knocked offline because of a single point of failure. There's various bridges apart from the main bridge in the Crimean bridge in from Russia. There's various bridges over sort of river creeks and road crossings and normal things, and you can just hammer those one by one. You've also got the bridges, of course, into Crimea in the north, in the Almiansk area, which are not huge bridges over the Crimean Canal, and then the main one over near Chonhar, over Sviash is where the railway connection goes through. And again, you know, that's quite a wide riverway, so you can just hammer that. And if they repair it, you just keep on hammering it again. If you've got the drones and the Ranger drones, and that makes it very difficult to keep the Crimean railway network going because it's so vulnerable to these single points of failure. And it looks like they're hammering multiple points of failure. So they're hammering Vladyslavivka, they're hammering Kerch, they're hammering Dzhankoy, and all various other points as well. And you just end up with so many points down and so many bridges or bits of infrastructure that need to be repaired. In effect, I suspect it'll be offline completely now. The Russians will just give up trying to put it back into traffic because the Ukrainians will just kill it as soon as it's back in traffic. And sometimes they actually have a habit of waiting to knock it until the Russians have repaired it, so that they go to all that effort of repairing it and waste a load of time on it, only for it to be bonked, you know, within as soon as it comes back online. And again, that's quite clever because it distracts a load of effort over something that you know they're going to whack like whack-a-mole. And you know, sure enough, as it no sooner as it comes back online, that it has been whacked. So at the moment, the last I heard, trains were getting as far as Kerch on Crimea. But the bridge has been closed recently, certainly for road traffic, I think, possibly rail traffic as well. It wouldn't surprise me if they even give up trying to get as far as Kerch. The port's been hammered, and oil storage facilities there have been hammered, and I suspect that it won't be long at all before Kerch becomes pretty much untenable for the Russians. It's not the ideal place to start doing transfers from rail to road anyway, so I suspect that the Russians will just get pushed back into Russia, and the Kerch Bridge will just effectively become unusable in terms of the rail aspect, because everything on the Crimean side has just been blown up. And of course, this is simultaneously as the two connections in the north, Armyansk from Kherson, the similar thing has happened. Connections there have been blown up, and also the line towards Melitopol, and again both the parallel road connections. Again, they've been, the bridges there have been hit. So it all just becomes very difficult for the Russians, and they're just gradually getting strangled in Crimea. And we've heard, I think in the last 24 hours, the announcement they've just completely given up on fuel to civilians now. The only people who can get fuel, I think, are the Russian military. So forget about holidays. Anybody was thinking of going to Crimea on holiday, well, that's just been cancelled for them. And the railways are now not getting through. And whether Russians are actually receiving reports, reliable reports on the ground, or they're just not listening or whatever, who knows. But it's pretty clear if anybody tries to go there, they're going to have a pretty hard time getting there, and almost likely going to be turning back. And it's quite critical at the moment because this is just the start of the Russian holiday season, Crimea being the sort of plum holiday destination, and that's basically just been cancelled for them.
Oh no, cancelled holidays, you say? There have actually been a lot of reports of cancelled holidays, as it happens. Along with cancelled holidays, people are deciding to leave Crimea for good, you know. People who came here in 2014. These things keep happening. Hey, I finally got some function on my flipping co-host. That's something at least. But yeah, there was a guy moaning the other day who was a real estate salesman, and he was like, real estate, it's really like, you know, there's nobody wants to buy any real estate in Sevastopol anymore, and so there's loads of really cheap real estate going, and people are like, you know, halving the price to try and get sales, and nobody wants it. And I don't understand. And it was killing me because, of course, you don't understand because you're not paying attention. I'm just going to say, I think the host phone just unmuted a second ago. So just be aware of that, person who has the host phone. Thank you. Because if you're going to go for a wee, I might hear you. And I don't want that. Thank you. Brian. Hello, love.
Well,
You all
I
right?
could just for a wee, maybe the person's in the throes of passion right now. I mean that's always a possibility. So it depends on how vocal you are, I guess, during that particular activity.
Thanks,
That's
Brian. Thanks for that mental image.
it's an occupational risk. When you take the host phone, so you just got to be careful. We're in a digital age now. What I would say also is that, and I personally am really broken up about this. I don't know if you remember a few years ago. Remember when all those people were in the beach in the cabanas on the beach in Crimea, and there was like explosions happening in the distance. You remember this? It was like a sunny day, and the Ukrainians had hit some target in Crimea, and then you could see people kind of hurriedly getting up from the cabanas and sort of gathering up their towels and their gear and headed for the cars because they'd want to be in the beach anymore with explosions happening in the distance. I'm just disappointed and frankly disheartened that we are not going to see apparently a repeat of that, since the tourist bookings on the peninsula from mainland Russia have gone down significantly. So that is a tragedy. And I have to say, I think we should have a moment of silence in honor of the Russian tourists who will not be making either the trip at all, or maybe tried to make the trip, but decided that having no food and no fuel and not having enough gas to drive the car back across the bridge back to Russia was not as the time that they envisioned. So I think in honor of them, we should have a moment of remembrance. Back to you.
Indeed. It would seem that well, there was one guy who was like, I'm thinking of going to Crimea because all the prices have dropped. So I think, it'd be nice and cheap right now. And someone from Ukraine messaged him back and said, well, if you're going, take some spare fuel and probably a tin hat for you and your family, and some an IFAC and some tourniquets, and make sure that you've got literally everything you need. Probably some spare water. And the guy was like, "You're joking, aren't you?" And he was like, "The armed forces of Ukraine do not joke."
I love it.
TKD, good to see you. Welcome up.
Thank you. I'm glad I was able to come up. I just wanted to let everyone know that I have gone and put Intel Schizo's posts in the nest. This is the one that Peter had shared with us in the background and asked us to post. What I did is I actually shared it on my own TKD Bach profile in a nest thread for the space. For now, I'm not going to put any of the announcements or the fundraisers in there yet, just to kind of keep that clean. But this way, if a listener is listening on Spotify later, or if for some reason we have technical difficulties and have to restart the space, we'll be able to keep track of all of Peter and Macher's illustrations and visuals there in that thread. Thanks. Hope that helps. Slava Ukraini.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thanks.
Dan the man. Go for it.
Oh yeah, I'm still a man. Yeah. When you're talking about and you're reading the letters from the vacationers or that can't be, or the people stuck in airports, this shows you the average information that these folks are getting, or that they've managed to not or ignore because they were too busy getting more things or food for themselves and their vacation, not what's going on with their country. So yeah, this is a good example of the average thought process of the Russian populace. Thank you. And I don't care if they don't get their vacation. Boo hoo.
Yeah, I haven't had one of those in a decade. So if I can live, they can. Hello, host phone. Did you log into the host phone to keep us stable? That's very kind of you. Thank you, darling. Thanks. That was
I
Prince
fixed
logging
it.
into
It
the host
should
phone.
show muted now.
No, you're all good. You're all good. Thank you. I was just terrified I was going to hear things that I didn't need to hear. So you know how these things go. So I wanted to just point out as well. I sent Prince one last thing to put into the nest because you know how my life is. Nothing works for me. And it's a guy traveling to Crimea, apparently with his own fuel tank on top of his car. And, well, this is an enterprising idea, but I hate to say it, mate, unless you've got an armed guard, the minute you pull that up, the police are likely to come and take it away from you because that looks like an explosion just begging to happen.
And a
Either
good
that
target
or
for a drone.
exactly. Yeah.
Good drone target. Yeah.
Well, either that or some, enterprising young men might just pop along and relieve you of this item as well. So, best thing for the police to do is to come and take it off you so that they have some fuel for their vehicle instead. So, yeah, I have a feeling that that thing won't last very long in its current condition. But I wanted to just pop that into the nest just to show how enterprising people can be when they don't have any fuel. I do feel as though there's going to be some sort of Hunger Games situation going on very soon with regards to fuel. I mean, people are already screaming at one another when the mobile fire teams that actually, protect Crimea from drones, when they went to the front of the queue to get some fuel at one of the gas stations, the people in the queue who were like next in the queue went absolutely ballistic. And they were like, but we're servicemen. And they were like, we don't care. That's our spot in the queue. I just thought that was really funny because, it's like every man for himself and, women first. So it really did cheer me up to see them all like just fighting over the last scraps of whatever's left. And we've seen people, fighting little old ladies fight over sugar and stuff like that. So these things are going to happen, and it's going to keep happening. And it's only going to get worse because how are they going to get their fuel there now? We'll talk about that in a minute, Peter. But I'm just going to clear off these hands. Go ahead, Dan. I'll go back to you a second.
Yeah, I just was curious. I think you read it one night. I was up. Were you the one about somebody actually removed a gas tank off of another vehicle to get gas? How do you remove a gas tank from a car? I mean, that's that seems like it's like, I don't know. It's not productive. Thank you.
It's not normal, is it?
Is anything normal though? Really, in these cases, yeah. Lexicon, go ahead, my dear.
Well, I'm so worried. I'm so concerned about definitions. I mean, first of all, the country was called a gas station with an army, and now, like, it doesn't seem to be a gas station or an army. And then somebody was writing that what's the tipping point? When is it called an occupied country, and when is it, I mean, occupied peninsula, and when is it cut off? And I want to know my own personal question. I see there's long lineups at the Kerch Bridge of 600, and then somebody else just said 700 cars. You know the way panic has this habit of growing like wildfire. So I want to know, when can it be called an exodus? So I really have a lot of questions about definitions today.
Well, yeah, I would say that there seems to be an awful lot of people just suddenly decided that they need to be somewhere else, hasn't there? I honestly think the time to go home was last week, but I think this is going to be something that will probably just keep the Ukrainians from taking out the Kerch Bridge for a couple of extra days, perhaps. Magyar's birds did point out that they had a good view of the bridge from all angles overnight last night, which tells me that they're gearing up to doing something else. There was rumours that they were actually going to hit the Kerch Bridge last night, and a couple of people had sort of hinted that to me. However, what they did do was they hit some of the air defence units that were actually on the bridge. 2 pantsiers, I believe, were on the bridge. I think they were pantsers. But 2 air defence systems were actually on the bridge, and both of those systems got hit, one at each end. And that tells you something, doesn't it? That Ukraine know exactly where everything is, exactly where it is. So let us go back to our rail situation, because there is obviously some more rail stuff to go through, and as we can see from what we finally managed to fix in the nest, woohoo! Thank you everybody for coming to my aid. That there's been quite a bit going on. So again, you know that X that you were talking about, where everything sort of goes through Dzhankoy. Well, this bridge, that in particular, they took a nice picture of it, and this was the bridge on the bottom, sort of that X leg. Which was going towards Kerch. That was the one that's sort of got the red boxes round it on the image there. And as you can quite clearly see, that bridge was broken in the middle there. And even if they repair that, they're going to just keep hitting that, aren't they? Because they know exactly where that is now, don't they, Peter?
Yeah, and there's not really a lot you can do about that. I mean, the only thing you can do, I suppose, is try and build, whatever's beneath it, a river or a brook or something, is try and build up earth to try and, not turn it into a bridge, to turn it into an actual causeway kind of thing. But it's just, if they do that, then they'll just go, 50 kilometres down the line and just knock the next bridge, because the nature of railways is you're constantly crossing river crossings or roads or other sort of geographical features, and you'll just knock the weakest, like whack-a-mole. You'll just knock the next weakest structure, and there's several points where the railway line from Kerch on towards Dzhankoy has been broken, and I think if you go to the 1, 2, 3, 4, there's some weird stuff in the nest at the beginning, but if you go to the 4th item in the nest now, and then go down a little bit to the Intel Schizo's rail map of Crimea, where you see Sevastopol in the left bottom corner. That's the bottom of the X. And then Simferopol and Yevpatoria, actually a little branch to Yevpatoria, coming up towards Dzhankoy, and then Dzhankoy is in the middle of the X. And if you look at that, you'll see why it's so significant. And then the line carries on towards Chonhar and off towards, it says Henichesk on the map there, which is another branch off, and then it carries on towards Melitopol, and then the other direction north from Dzhankoy, northwest, goes up through Armyansk and onto Kherson, and of course everything at the moment now is going south towards Kerch. And there's about 4 points where they've either hit trains or bridges. And again, if they hit a train, then it takes time to clear it. Usually doesn't take that much time, but when you've hit a train and disable that, and then you hit a bridge and you can't get to the train to rescue it, everything just gets snarled up. And I think it's now got to the stage, and they've got such drone coverage, I suspect the Ukrainians will just simply not allow the Russians to reopen this railway. They'll just keep on hitting it as soon as, if not before, the Russians actually get it back up and running again. And I think, as I've said, that they're pretty much all the way to Kerch now. You see Feodosia on the bottom leg of the X, which is actually a little branch off from the junction at Vladyslavivka, which is where the second strike is superimposed on top of the one at Feodosia, and then the line along to Kerch, connecting up with the bridge. And effectively, that railway, I think, is now dead, and they are going to be struggling to move it. Well, they're not going to be able to move anything, I think, in Crimea by rail. So they're going to have to get all their supplies to effectively to the Kerch bridge by rail, and then the Ukrainians are going to bonk that, or going to bonk Kerch and Taman, the two terminals. And pretty soon we'll find that there'll be enough Ukrainian drones over the Kerch bridge and in that general area, the Russians won't even be able to get that far, and we will effectively have a sort of, a complete strangulation and really a siege of Crimea. And when you haven't got food, you haven't got the drones, you haven't got the supplies, but most importantly oil, then you're really in a difficult situation, and the Ukrainians are going to take advantage of that. So yeah, the map that I'm looking at now is the second map down in Intel Schizo's post. The one at the top is quite interesting. I'll come to that in a moment, a bit later. That shows a number of strikes in Bryansk Oblast, inside Russia, which is quite new. We haven't really seen drone strikes on trains inside Bryansk until relatively recently. And again, this is a sign that the Ukrainians are getting further and further behind the Russian lines and causing more and more problems with supplies. But we'll come to that a bit later. At the moment, I was just looking at the Crimea map and how the rail network sort of relates to the rest of the geography, in particular Simferopol, which is effectively the capital of Crimea, and Sevastopol, which is the key militarized port. Which, even when it was Ukraine, Russia had a lease of that after 1992, when Ukraine went independent. They agreed a lease where Russia leased the port of Sevastopol from Ukraine and paid an amount to them every year until 2014, when they just used it as a springboard for invasion. And so when Ukraine gets Crimea back, I suspect the lease arrangement on Sevastopol will somehow have been deemed to have been terminated by the Russians, and they won't be getting that back. Anyway, there we go.
Yeah, I will just add that it isn't really Russia, is it? It's just a temporary situation, temporarily occupied. But I know what you meant. Now, the effects on all these bridges have become visible because trains, indeed, as of sort of a couple of days ago, had to terminate at Kerch. So the rest of the journey was only available by bus transfer, which tells you just how badly the train network is just taken out. All Tavria trains arriving and departing from Crimea on June the 20th begin and end all routes in Kerch. From June the 10th until the end of September, some Tavria train routes were shortened to Kerch, while other trains continued to run to Feodosia, Simferopol and Sevastopol, only now they probably don't. So it says here, oh yes, however, due to the temporary closure of one section of the Crimean railway on the 20th of June, that would be because you've got no bridge, trains whose routes have not been changed since June the 10th will also only operate to Kerch. Passengers will then be transported by bus to and from the Kerch to Yuzhna station. I'm going to say that's good enough for what Anna wanted. But yes, that is certainly something which is obviously going to cause a lot of slowdown and a lot of difficulty with transportation of any sort of goods. I mean, it's not just people that are travelling along here, is it? I would imagine there was quite a few goods, stuff for the shops, food, water, because let's face it, Crimea does not have its own proper water supply. All these sorts of things that had to be brought in were generally going to be brought in by freight train, weren't they? And not anymore, buddy. In fact, this morning there was a suggestion that anything that needed to travel via the Kerch entryway to Crimea now needed to go via the land route all the way through and over the Chonghar Bridge. And how's that going to go? How do you think that's going to go?
Probably going to go boom.
Exactly.
Yes. One of the things to point out, which is probably not obvious to most people, it is to me, because I kind of live railways and breathe railways. But one of the things to just understand, and it applies equally from railways to shipping as well. It's a sort of magnitudes up, is that the volume issue of how many trucks you would need to replace one train, and consequently how many trains you need to replace one ship. And this became a bit of an issue with Ukrainian grain in through Odessa, and grain and other raw materials that was going out by boat. People were saying, well, just run it by train, through Central Europe and up to the Mediterranean or wherever, somewhere else. And it just isn't that simple. The economics and the practicalities of transport are such that really certain commodities endear themselves towards transport by ship, and grain and stuff like that, things like coal and things like that, and raw materials in very large quantities, you cannot compete on cost grounds with shipping. You just can't. Because they can deal with such enormous volumes that you would need enormous amounts of trains to do that. And it's a bit of a similar issue between step down from trains to truck. If you look at a typical railway box car, you think, oh, that's a sort of railway box car, but by which I mean sort of, general freight vehicle, which you could put, anything inside, either civilian stuff or military stuff. And in Russia, the loading gauge, so the profile is very wide, so you can actually get a lot in there. And to put that on a truck, you probably need 5 or 6 trucks at least for one railway boxcar. And if your train has got, say, 50 boxcars on it, just do the maths on that, on how many trucks you need to replace one train. It's just different multiples. And so I don't know what the exact figure is, but let's say it's 5 trucks for one car, and you've got 50 cars, so you're talking about 250 trucks just to replace one train. And the logistics of loading and unloading and getting all this stuff transshipped, one of the biggest problems and bottlenecks is transshipment. And this is why the break of gauge, the gauge change, is a real headache for logistics nerds and transport people like me, because it's very expensive and it's very costly and it's very awkward to have to change your goods from one set of carriages to another, or to have to change the wheels or whatever to try and overcome the change in gauge, which is a natural obstacle. In fact, a very deliberate obstacle. Back in Tsarist times, they deliberately made it a different gauge, so it would be difficult for military invasion. Well, of course, that works both ways. But anyway, so it's not as simple as Russian logistics, because their roads are generally so bad, and they're very much geared up towards being a sort of bulk producers and dealing with these things in bulk. If it's inland, it tends to go by train, and if it's near a port, it'll go by sea, and that's just how Russia works. And you're not really going to change that very easily. So if you've got a train of, say, 50 carriages going into Crimea with all kinds of stuff on it, general merchandise, some military stuff, some refrigerated stuff, some whatever, you're talking about, to replace that train, you might need 250 or more trucks, and you've got to stop to take time and cost of transship those goods from the train onto those 250 trucks, and then get those trucks to where they're going instead of the train going to where it was going originally. So it is an unbelievable headache, which is the polite way of saying it. There's a ruder word, but it will really screw up the Russians' whole logistics, because their whole modus operandi is based on using rail, and if that disappears, it will just completely pull the rug from underneath their feet, and they will really struggle, because that's just the way they are. They're set up. They're quite rigid. They're quite inflexible, and when they're being hammered from all angles, i.e., from the north of Crimea and the land bridge and the Kerch bridge, they're just being hit every which way. And very quickly, as we've seen, the initial things, the shops are getting empty shelves, fuel's running out, and then you've got this sort of Hunger Games type thing. People just get the hell out of there, and it starts to get very difficult for them. So that, I think, is the situation we're in, and I hope it is only just the beginning, because that's the way it's really going to crack. Along with, of course, what's going on in Moscow, which is a completely different level. That's on the political level, which will crack things politically, whereas this will sort of crack things logistically on the front, and will cause the front effectively to collapse at some point. What I cannot tell you is when and how quickly. I wish I could. I wish I had a crystal ball. If I had have predicted it, I would have predicted that it would happen. It would have happened already. I'm actually astonished that the Russians have been able to hold it together for as long as they have. But the fact they're launching drones out of Kherson, they have been up to now, tells you that the supply lines must be working, because they must be getting resupplied with all those drones and the petrol and the fuel and the food and everything else they need. And Kherson Oblast is really exposed on a limb, because if they lose the transport through the Kerch bridge and up through Dzhankoy and Armyansk up to Kherson, and they lose the land corridor through Mariupol, Berdyansk and up towards them, that's just them just cut off completely. And there's a limit to how long you can last in that sort of situation. And other military people will, other people who are military, rather, I'm not a military at all. Other people who are military will be able to tell you how critical the supply lines are. And the moment you lose them, you're basically done for.
Indeed. Patrick Soup, welcome up.
Yeah, really interesting discussion. I had two questions. The first one, actually, I'm gonna make a referral to an old situation when the Soviets started to build the wall in Berlin, and the Allied forces basically had to build an air bridge as like a substitution of providing goods to West Berlin. I'm just wondering, not that it's possible, of course, for the Russians to build an air bridge, but my first question basically is, what are their options? The only option I see for them currently is, using civilian transport forcibly. So you start to force civilians, from the land bridge to Crimea, to transport certain kind of goods in small quantities to at least stay alive. So that's my first question. How much is that viable, and are there other options? And the second option, the second question, I don't know if you have an answer for this, is when Russia took Crimea in 2014, they started building all this military infrastructure. They started building all these factories, which actually are taking a lot of the water supply. My question is, do you have a view on how important those that military infrastructure on Crimea still is for the other areas? For example, the provisions in Kherson.
Okay, so there's quite a few different topics there. Let's start off with the 1948 and the Berlin airlift. So what happened then was, in the immediate post-war era, the Soviets or the Russians, in effect, tried to starve out West Berlin. So there was Berlin as the capital was divided. We're going a bit off track here, but I'll explain the relevance. Berlin was divided amongst the four victorious powers, Britain, France, America, and Russia, and they had zones within Berlin as the capital. But the whole of Berlin, the Soviet zone, connected directly onto East Germany, but the whole of Berlin was completely surrounded by East Germany. So West Berlin effectively was a completely surrounded exclave, if you like, and the Russians decided just to cut off all the land supply and not allow any goods or anything, any traffic through to West Berlin. And the Allies said, "Screw this! We're just going to supply them by air." And for I think it was 6 or 9 months, West Berlin, and the population wasn't massive. It was only, I think, 1 or 2 million in those days, or maybe a little bit more. But everything came in by air, and there was a lot of rationing. And the Allies just said, "We're just going to do this for as long as we want, as long as we need to." And after 6 or 9 months, the Soviets just gave in and let them re-establish the land corridors, which they were entitled to under the Yalta Treaty, under the post-1945 conventions. They were entitled to have land corridor access to West Berlin, and that just resumed. And of course, the Berlin Wall was a bit later. That didn't come along until 1961. That was happened really because of the brain drain of talent from East Germany and from East Berlin. All the young people, the professionals, the doctors decided, bugger this, I'm off to the West, and they all moved, said goodbye to their families, and eventually, to stop them, they put a wall up and a big barbed wire fence around East Germany, supposedly not to let the Westerners in, but no, it wasn't. It was to stop their professional classes and their hemorrhaging of talent and people that were leaving leaving Berlin. Now, the issue there is that in 1948 you didn't have to deal with drones. You didn't have any drones, or not many anyway. So the Allies could just fly in by air, and unless the Russians were going to shoot Allied civilian planes and freighter planes down, which they weren't going to do, that would have been too dangerous, too risky. There wasn't going to be a problem. Now, if the Russians tried to supply Crimea by air, it won't work on multiple grounds, primarily drones and primarily, well, they haven't got any fuel in Crimea, so how are you going to refuel your airplanes to be able to take off to get back? It just won't work on so many levels. So I think that's almost a non-starter, and I think I'm not quite sure what the population of Crimea is, but the Russians just don't, in my view, probably just do not have the logistical organizational skills to be able to supply somewhere like Crimea by air. I think what they would try and do is they would try and supply it via sea, via sort of some other point on the coast. Now, where you just don't know. And of course, the drone coverage is going to be so big, and it's going to be so sort of saturated. They're going to struggle doing that, because, as we've seen already, the Ukrainians are strangulating shipping in the Sea of Azov, and they seem to have that pretty much under control. And anyone who wants to run a ship into Berdyansk or Mariupol, bang, the bridge gets hit. The ship doesn't get hit, but you knock the bridge out, that's it. You can't control the ship, so the ship's dead. And the same thing is likely to happen if they try to supply Crimea by ship. We've already seen the ships across the Kerch Strait be sunk multiple times. The old fleet of 3 train ferries that they used to have all been put out of action, and the new replacement one that they managed to buy from Greece has just been put out of action in the last week. And I think various other ships have been bonked too. So that's really the situation there. What were the other points then? Sorry, that was the 1948 and supplying by air. Was
Yeah. Sorry. I was just wondering, are like civilians able to at least, like the transport via civilians, maybe forcibly, because Ukrainians can't obviously drone civilians that much. Can it be like an option for the Russians, even a viable option?
They did disguise some vehicles, didn't they, as civilian vehicles? They started repainting some of their Euro trucks to make them look as though they were regular civilian vehicles. And they also seconded like Wildberries, delivery trucks. And remember the pile of wood, which was obviously wood stacked around a fuel tanker on the back of a truck. If they're going to do it with trucks and pretend to be civilian vehicles, I think mostly what they were doing is they were taking the civilian vehicles and having, the armed forces drive them. So they were basically like, you see that, that's going to become army property now. I'm not sure that they would be able to get enough with civilian drivers. One of the things is that most civilian drivers are asking for about a year's worth of wages now to drive through that road because it is just too risky for them. Peter?
Yeah, I think this is a sort of measure, an indication of the level of desperation. Russians will, we know that they will use hospital vehicles, they will use civilian vehicles, and they will do that. That you can get away with that at the start, and you might get a few through, but it won't take long before the Ukrainians, who've got drones up, reconnaissance drones up all the time, are going to see this. They're going to spot what's going on. They'll spot the patterns. They'll know where these trucks are going to, and pretty quickly they're just going to end up with, oh right, this is a military truck. This is a military truck just disguised as a wild berries or some other thing, and we can see it's military, and then they'll just bonk it, and then they'll know what they're looking for because other ones will come in following the same pattern, and 3 days later the game will be up, and I think it'll just be a futile exercise, and they're just they might buy themselves a few days, but it isn't going to solve the problem because the Ukrainians are not that stupid, and they'll see what's going on, and if suddenly all the traffic is wild berries or whatever it is, then they'll make a judgment on what is in these trucks, and then when they send a drone into them and there's a giant explosion, that'll tell them what's in there. The other thing, of course, where the Russians have been helping, they've said that now civilian traffic is banned on various roads, I think including the highway to Crimea from Mariupol. So that effectively helps the Ukrainians. If civilian traffic's banned, well, then anything on that road has got to be military, so it's fair game. So that's as simple as that. They've kind of shot themselves in the foot there. Yeah, in terms of getting stuff in, the amount of volume of goods and logistics and transport that you need to keep somewhere like Crimea afloat, and not including things like water, because obviously the Crimea's water supply used to be from the Novokakhovka Dam and sort of via the Crimean Canal, and that's now dried up many years. So they've now got a problem with water, and if they've got industrial plants that are using water, which probably isn't available now, that's going to be a problem. So, the factories are not going to work because they haven't got the water supply that they need or whatever. It's going to become increasingly difficult for civilians, obviously, including, unfortunately, presumably some Ukrainians who are still there. But what choice have the Ukrainians got? They've got to get it back. That's really the only way of doing it until the Russians get the message and either go home or the situation collapses and there's some sort of an event in Moscow which forces the matter. It's certainly fascinating, and it's very good to see it come this far, because I was listening to one of Jonathan Fink's recent broadcast recently, and he sort of more or less said one of his earliest interviews he did was with General Ben Hodges, and it was entitled Crimean Siege, and this was about 3 years ago. Well, he said he was kind of right, but he was wrong with the timing. He was 3 years ahead of himself. It took that long for the Ukrainians to get themselves back in this position. And if you remember, prior to the October 7th attack in the Middle East, many years ago now, I forget even what year that was, the Ukrainians were advancing steadily, and we all thought that was Putin's birthday, and I think there was a lot of suggestion that the Kerch Bridge, which had been bombed successfully in the previous year or about a year prior, was due for another bombing, and the Ukrainians were sort of steadily getting that far and were likely to make it. And of course, what's happened since is that the whole thing has been blown off course. Attention's gone elsewhere, and the Ukrainians have been starved of what they need, and it's taken us 3 years, and unfortunately 3 years of Ukrainian civilians having to take the brunt of Russian attacks every night for 3 years, in effect, to get effectively, I would say, back to where we were on about October the 6th, however many years ago it was now, and mine's just gone to jelly. But we are now clearly in the position where the Kerch Bridge is, well, I wouldn't want to be insuring it, put it that way, in the chance of it being there in the next 6 months, even though it's there now, it still exists. It's practically useless because the railway is a railway to nowhere now, and the bridge is closed half the time, and anybody going onto Crimea can't fill up their car with gas. They probably can't get any food and water soon, so it just becomes pointless. It's meaningless. It's a bit like some of the frontline positions, some of the key towns that were at one point were important logistical hubs. But then the nearer the front line gets to them, they lose their strategic significance because they're no longer sort of major frontline hubs. They're too near the front line. They're under attack. They lose their value. And I think the Kerch Bridge is heading that way. Right, Mockers, yeah, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I have some anecdotal data. So apparently, one truck driver who was driving what he said was civilian goods along that highway of death, he said that the Ukrainians landed one of their drones on top of his truck and then waited until a fuel truck came past him, and then they took off and went after the fuel truck. And so he was sat there thinking, oh my God, is my truck going to blow up? And no, they were just hitching a ride. Cheeky little cheekers.
Isn't that clever? Isn't that clever to conserve the battery power of the drone?
Absolutely. Very cheeky. And I just thought that was lovely. And there was actually a message to the people in Crimea who are rightfully residents of Crimea earlier on today. And I think it was Magyar who said this. And he said, basically, you're going to have to club together and look after one another while we get on with, taking this peninsula back. And one of the things he said was share firewood with each other, which tells you that there's going to be, a problem with electricity. And we have actually seen that today, haven't we? That they've started, that they've made a great deal of headway towards taking out some of the electrical power in Crimea. And share firewood. That was something which I just thought was particularly worth noting, that he's telling them that they're not going to have any power.
I think this is something that is going to get increasingly critical for the Russians. I mean, and Russians in Crimea and Russians in Russia proper, because when they start to run out of fuel, you're not going to last long. The whole system isn't going to last long. You can't get to work. You can't get to shops to pick up your food. The shops can't get deliveries. the whole thing is going to collapse. Therefore, I'm going to probably stick my neck out and make a prediction and say that something's going to snap before the winter, because when the winter comes along, by God, you've got a problem. You know, you can have temperatures quite regularly in Moscow down to minus 15, minus 20. And, you know, it's very difficult to operate with that level of hardship. And obviously, we've seen similar in Ukraine. This last winter was horrendously cold. Hopefully they won't have another one that cold. And I think this winter coming is going to be very different, because the Russians are going to get a big taste of their own medicine, given that the Ukrainians now have knocked most of their, or a lot of their oil production facilities offline, and are likely to knock a lot of their critical electrical energy and other stuff, other logistical support offline. You know, even way back into into beyond Moscow, St. Petersburg. You know, St. Petersburg and Moscow easily in range. They're going way beyond that. So I think it's going to be a very different story this winter, and whether we even reach that winter, who knows, because things may get to a tipping point before then. Hopefully they will as soon as possible. But I think there's one other critical factor here that a lot of people probably don't take into account, but we see it in the comments Russians are making, is that the Ukrainians have become quite well adjusted to living with this kind of horrendous situation. Been through 4 or 5 winters now, lived through it, through drone attacks, through missile attacks, you know, shelters, civil society is sticking together, people are supporting each other, they're making do, they're keeping businesses running. They obviously, you know, have got supplies of fuel, probably a lot of it going by road. And the Russians, conversely, are just completely do not know what is going to hit them. They are not geared up for being attacked. They are just brainwashed by, you know, watching their television, pretending everything's fine, everything's going according to plan. And, you know, even when drones appear in the sky, there's no air raid alarms, nothing. It's just going to be an absolute field day. Air defense don't know what they're doing, of course, and half the time the bombing their own civilians and their own oil tanks and all sorts of stuff like that, because they're just so incompetent. They're putting air defense on top of residential buildings, whereas you look at the Ukrainian air defense, they're hardened. They've been doing this for 4.5, 5 years. They know what they're doing. They're organized. They're capable. They've got a sort of system in place. The Russians are just going to get absolutely mullered. But that's just my thoughts, and trying to predict the future. So there we are.
Well, it's difficult to predict the future, isn't it? But there are some things that you can say are inevitable. Now, when I said about, you know, that they said share some firewood, well, the Cheskaya thermal power plant was hit within the last sort of couple of days, and was continuing to burn yesterday. So obviously problems there. The TES oil and gas storage facility in Bachkasari also was burning. And there was a fire reported at the railway entrance to the Crimean Titan plant in Armyansk. And I'm sure all of those things would have been, you know, quite troublesome. You're right, that they are not prepared for what's coming for them. They don't even understand that they're at war, half of them. So, you know, there's that going for them. And just to note, you mentioned the Tumen facility earlier, way over there. It is 2,070 kilometres. And this was in particular 2 new Firepoint drones that were sent to hit this target. Now, I'm not sure how many other drones went with them, but 2 of the new Firepoint drones hit the target. He doesn't say which ones they are. And he said, this is Zelensky talking here. He said there will also be drones that will reach 3,000 plus kilometres. These are the new drones we are producing. We understand where all their military plants, oil bases, gas storage facilities are, and we now have the tools to hit them at these longer distances. That's some tasty words, isn't it? That's some tasty words. He seems to be giving an interview here, just out in the open, talking to somebody. So he's just given a nice nice long interview in the middle of the street there, which looks to have been pretty empty, actually. I imagine they had to empty a space to have him give that interview like that. And a little message from Romanov Light here. By the night of June the 22nd, Crimea is ready, and we are waiting. Does he mean that they're waiting for all hell to break loose again? Because that will be probably what's going to happen. There was a few more rail bridges that we can definitely say got hit within the last 48 hours. So the railway bridge that met the northern bank at Chonghar. This bridge was previously attacked on June the 13th, and they obviously repaired it enough, and Ukraine said, no, I don't think so. No, I don't think so. So I've noticed that Ukrainians do this. They wait until they've spent all their time and their energy fixing something, and then they smash it again. They wait, they wait until they've cut the ribbon to reopen it, and then they smash it, because they want them to use up all their time and energy and, stuff, logistics, electrical connections and all this sort of stuff. They want them to waste that as much as they possibly can. So let's just go over the situation from the last 24 hours. The Port Kavkaz oil product transshipment complex hit. The Port Kavkaz platform for accumulation and waiting before loading onto the ferry, where there was apparently quite a few fuel trucks there, hit. The Kerch Seaport Industrial Zone TES terminal, the railway terminal for transshipment and storage of petroleum products and liquefied gas, hit. A military unit belonging to the 630th Separate Railway Battalion, part of the 39th Separate Railway Brigade. That location was also on fire. They also hit the railway bridges of Rozdolny and Vladyslavivka, which we mentioned earlier. And just to top it all off, there was a diesel locomotive taken out by the SBS. So, just in case you were thinking of using that diesel locomotive, and no, you don't. And of course, they also a couple of days ago hit the underground gas storage facility of Naftagaz, those people. And it would seem that, they are basically saying, yeah, Crimea, you're not going to have any production, you're not going to have any storage, and you're not going to have any trains, and you're not going to have any supply, and, just in case you thought things were going to get fixed, they're not. And I particularly enjoy these messages delivered kinetically, don't you, Peter?
Yes, I do. It's good to see not only the progress, but it's good to see the level of sort of attacks and things being put out of commission, because that's what's going to make the difference. If you just sort of do one or two, it's not going to, you're not going to have that much different. But when you see the report coming in on, this is what we did last night, bang, 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 a whole great long list of stuff. And that in itself might not be critical, but on top of what they did the previous night and the night before that, and you add them all together, and I think they're just systematically going after sort of whatever high value targets. I think we've known for a long time they've had a lot of targets, and they've just not had the means to deal with those targets. I think what seems to be happening now is particularly with these medium range drones, they're getting a lot of the means to go after a lot of these targets that they've known about for a long time, would like to have done, but just haven't had the weapons to be able to do that. and now the sort of tables are turning, and they have got enough drones to be able to do that. They're sort of kind of making the most of it, and I think that this leads to another point. If you go to one of the maps in the Intel Schizo maps in the TKD Bach chain, which is in the web, which is in the nest rather. If you go down, depends which one you go to, but down beneath the Crimean map, there's another map of the bridge that's been knocked out with the red circles around it, and then there's this crazy fuel tank nonsense on top of a car, and then below that. There's quite an interesting map of which clearly shows the border between both Ukraine and Belarus. Actually, in fact, it's mostly Belarus and Russia. So inside Bryansk Oblast, there's 4 different hits of trains into Bryansk Oblast. One at the junction, which I think is near Klintsy, there after this sort of back road, and then Starodub further south, and then 2 more hits over towards Pochep, towards Bryansk. Now, that in itself probably isn't significant until you know that really this is I think the first time that we've seen a significant number of attacks on trains by drones. I assume these are drone attacks. Um, you know, sit further into Russia. So they appear to be completely starting to isolate that part of Bryansk Oblast and working up towards Bryansk. So are they going to do another Kursk Oblast type thing? Are they just trying to trip the ground lines of communication further back into Russia? You know, what's going on? Who knows? It could be anything. But that is on one of the important supply routes as well, from Gomel or Homyel in Belarus towards Bryansk. So there's probably quite a bit of military traffic going that way between Belarus and Bryansk, although that's not the main line. The main line via Orsha, Smolensk, and Vyazma is much further north. But it is interesting that the Ukrainians are not only looking at getting rid of the bridges and the rail infrastructure in Crimea and on the land bridge and around Mariupol, but they're also looking at going into Russia, and very good thing too, because the further they can push the supply lines back into Russia, particularly in Bryansk, Kursk, and Rostov oblasts, that will effectively starve the front lines into Donbass and make the Ukrainians' lives a lot easier and the Russians' lives consequently harder to just get supplies to the front line where they're needed. So that is quite an interesting development that sort of caused me a few raised eyebrows. And if you do see any of these posts of trains being hit, there's a couple of things to look out for, which will tell you a number of things. Firstly, look out if when you see the drone coming down on the train, see if it's a double track railway or if it's just a single track. So if it's just a train on a single line, that tells you basically that it's pretty much a secondary route. It's not a main line, because all the main lines are double tracked with an up line and a down line, so you can massively increase your traffic. Whereas if you've got only a single line, you have to have passing loops, and you can only get a much smaller throughput through there. So that's one thing to look out for. The other thing to look out for is if the railway is electrified, has overhead catenary, so you'll see the masts on the side of the line, and you wouldn't normally in a drone picture be able to pick up the actual overhead catenary, the wires, but that would indicate that it's an electrified railway, either single or double line, and most of the main lines, well, virtually all the main lines are electrified, so that they would be electrified. That will tell you whether it's an electrified route or a diesel route, a non-electrified route. And if it's electrified, then it's more important and more significant. And the same with the locomotives. You might be able to see whether they're diesels or electrics being hit, and sometimes they're not described correctly in the text, but it's just a little pointer to sort of give you out. And then in Crimea, the railway from Kerch to Dzhankoy is just a single line, and then when it gets to Dzhankoy, the old main line, which used to go from Sevastopol to Simferopol, is actually a single line, and then Simferopol up towards Dzhankoy and up through Chonkar or Sviash and into Melitopol is an electrified double track main line, but it's not really used as that anymore because it kind of goes to nowhere these days. So, but in the old, that is a double track main line, but everything has now, of course, been diverted in effect either up to Melitopol and then across the new railway to Mariupol and into Russia, or more likely diverted at Dzhankoy round to Kerch and across the Kerch Bridge. So there we are. Hope that's helpful for everyone when they're looking out for railway drone pictures in future, to get a few pointers as to how significant the hit might be.
Now, I have a few items to bring to the room before we close down. This, I think, is just lovely stuff. Now, to be fair, one of the things Russia should absolutely do at this point is get as many civilians off Crimea as possible, because it would mean that it would decrease the risk of a chaotic and embarrassing evacuation later. It would also mean that they would, be able to divvy out their small amount of fuel a lot easier. There wouldn't be all these just people using up resources. They should absolutely close the peninsula to all non-essential traffic, including tourism, because again, there wouldn't be all these people getting in the way and taking videos of our air defence and, just generally eating food and drinking water and, just getting in the way, using up all the resources that we need for our armed services. Do you think they're going to do that? Do you think they're going to do that, Peter?
I don't think they're going to, because a matter of sort of pride and their own stupidity of wanting to pretend that everything is okay, because they're just not responsible. They don't care for the civilians at all. As far as they're concerned, they're just fodder. They're in it for themselves and for the sort of glory of their empire, and will not really face the reality or recognise the reality of the situation until it's too late. And this is largely because the Tsar has put in this system where he's not given bad news, because if he's given bad news, somebody flies out of a window, or gets a cup of tea or whatever, or a bullet in the back of the head that they shoot themselves with. I don't think that's going to happen. I think conversely with Ukraine, they have done their best to evacuate what villages they can where they come under intolerable sort of circumstances, and I think Kramatorsk is, broadly speaking, in that situation now. But even the Ukrainians haven't sort of forcibly evacuated people, or they only do at the last minute. And there have been situations where military people have been put at risk because of civilians refusing to leave and staying there. I think Russia is in a totally different boat. It's just a different system and a different mentality, and they won't evacuate the civilians because they just don't see the writing on the wall and won't want to admit that the inevitable is happening, and will try to say that everything's normal and everything's okay and don't panic and all this stuff. But as usual, the Russians are not acting in the best interests of their country and their population. They're acting in the perceived best interests of the leadership and their whole corrupt their corrupt regime, and that this fundamentally is the problem. So that I would say it's difficult to know how many people are still on Crimea. Crimea, obviously, the population goes up quite dramatically in the summer, in an ordinary summer, because of the holiday season, and a lot of the population is seasonal. And obviously that's not really going to happen this year. And you've got a lot of Russians who are just deciding it's too hot and are turning their tails and running back to Russia. What the population is now, I just am not able to keep track of it. And even if the Ukrainians even know, and even whether the Russians even know, of course, there aren't any sort of border controls or anything between Crimea and Russia over the Kerch Bridge. So probably whether the Russians, whether the Ukrainians even know how many people are on Crimea, I don't know. To be honest, I'm not even sure what the population is. I have seen a figure for it, but I can't remember off the top of my head, so I won't go making up figures. But it's clearly going to be quite a very difficult situation for those who are left on Crimea, and I think it's going to deteriorate very rapidly, because once you cut off water and fuel and food and all forms of transport, you've basically got a siege situation. If you've got a siege situation with a high proportion of civilians, that's not an ideal scenario, but it's the only possible scenario. So that's why it's happened, and it becomes a war of nerves and necessity in effect. So at what point it will give, or whether another part of the front line will give, like Kherson Oblast and further down, and bits of Zaporizhia Oblast pressing against Crimea, we don't know. We just have to wait and see how it plays out. But certainly the Ukrainians are in a far stronger position than they've been for many years, really, since the Kharkiv and the Kherson counteroffensives. And I think they probably got themselves back into a situation where something like that is now conceivable. But I think it will be done in a different way, because of the drone threat, and the whole nature of warfare has really changed since then. And I think they'll be using these drones to just cut off the supply lines and cut off Crimea completely, and then just wait until it effectively surrenders, because there's probably no other way. And that may be, I suppose that's unlikely to be by an order from Moscow. It could just be that the local commanders decide they've had enough at some point. Who knows? It's really difficult to know how it'll all play out. But I think that's the inevitable conclusion and the trajectory that we're clearly on. Okay, the only question is, how long is it all going to take? Anyway, we've got a couple of hands.
Yeah, I was just going to add that as far as the authorities are concerned, they'll be happy for people just to eat one another at this point. They've got no qualms about that, have they? Patrick Soup, you were first. Go ahead, my dear.
Yeah, just a comment about the number of people living in the Crimea. The Ukrainians have made a statement that since 2014, there are 1.5 million extra Russian colonizers. So basically, people who are not living there and who were mostly lured by cheap apartments, cheap conditions, basically favorable deals. And what we're currently seeing now already is that these prices for the real estate are dropping massively. So that's like a first sign already that a lot of people are, that were traditionally living there, so not tourists, are already gone. And what we also know are the current tourist numbers. I mean, they were put out there by the Russians themselves, but what we do know is that the number of bookings has gone down 50%. Compared to last year, and last year was already not so great, and especially the long-term bookings. So it were a lot of short-term bookings, and the long-term bookings are not happening, obviously. So we do know for sure that there are already a lot less people on the Crimea than previously.
Yeah, do you happen to know what the population of Crimea was originally before the war? I had a feeling it was somewhere around about 2 to 4 million, but I may be just completely.
I always had the number of 3.5 million, but yeah, the war being like prior 2014.
Yeah,
But that was, yeah.
yeah, that was my recollection. I just completely from memory, but I could look it up on Google. But I think that's about it. So I wouldn't be surprised if the actual numbers now there are probably round to about half what they should be, because a lot of people would have just given up. A lot of people would have moved out. A lot of people would have given up. A lot of people would have find it too difficult, and some Russians would have influxed into the place after 2014. A proportion of those are now going. Some of them would have gone earlier. Some of them will still be there. But yeah, who knows? Um, but yeah, if there's anything like 1.5 million living on that island, on that what is now an island, that's going to get tough very quickly, because that's the resources that you need to sustain 1.5 million people is a lot, and that's that will come to a head very quickly. So again, just keep watching.
Thanks, Stefan. Go
Thank you so
ahead.
much.
Oh, if you're saying me. Yeah, the other bit of logistics, or maybe you've already mentioned, but what the Ukrainians want to do, of course, is to come from the where Ukraine is on the Dnieper, so to have in some way come the shortest distance to Tokmak and Melitopol to cut off not just Crimea, but the whole, so that whole left flank of the Russians. And I just wondered if you'd already talked about the logistics we know Ukraine's been shaping that, but do you know something about what the main lines of uh, communications and supply are in that left flank of the Russians on the south bank of on the left bank of the Dnieper down at Kherson, well, to Tokmak and Melitopol.
Yeah, Melitopol is crucial, because that is the key access point into Crimea, and it sits at the top of a river inlet, quite wide, so you can't go any further south of that. So that's absolutely critical. And to get there, you basically need to go through Tokmak. So I'm quite sure in the 2023 offensive that didn't work out, I think the plan was to try and get Tokmak and then go on to Melitopol. That didn't work out, I think, largely because the Ukrainians didn't have enough equipment that what they needed. They didn't have air cover, and they also found that the Russians had been entrenched so long, they built these Surovikin lines defences, multiple sort of lines, and that was very difficult. The other thing that was really difficult is that the Russians just put 5-10 kilometers thick of these bloody landmines and just mined the hell out of the place, so that it just became totally impenetrable. And I think this was sort of before the war had turned to a drone war. It became very difficult to move on land because of this saturation land mining. And had the Ukrainians been able to do that earlier, then before the Russians has had time to prepare this Surovikin line and mine the hell out of the place, then, if the response from the West had been as it should have been, immediate and overwhelming, the Ukrainians could have moved earlier. But unfortunately, the West has been so hopeless and clueless, and given the Russians so much time, that they've effectively put the Ukrainians on a disadvantage, because they've given the Russians time to build up the defences and solidify their positions, which in an ideal world they wouldn't have been given the time to do. But I think that's it. And the Ukrainians certainly will be eyeing up Melitopol and trying to get there, because that will effectively, if they can get there, then it cuts off Kherson Oblast. Other than from Crimea, and Crimea, the connections are cut anyway. So I suspect that we will see that they will probably give a lot of drone coverage to the area between Melitopol up to the nearest, through Tokmak and up to the nearest point on the Ukrainian land that is still held, because that will effectively just create a drone wall that the Russians can't get through. And Melitopol is the shortest point to get to because it's sort of at the top of a river inlet which goes up to there, which forces the road to go further north to Melitopol and then down into Crimea. So I suspect that's something that is either in place already, we don't particularly know about it, or it's something that will come, and the Ukrainians will be wanting to get to both Tokmak and Melitopol, but how they do it with the defences on the grounds being so strong and all the the area being so heavily mined, I think the way to do it, they've probably realised, is they need to attack it from the other angle and just strangle the Russian supply lines, so they just run out of everything, and then the job's done for them. In effect, they won't need to go head on against them. They'll do them from the back. I think that would be my comment on that. But bear in mind, I'm not at all a military expert, but I am sort of reasonable on logistics, and in an army's advance, it's logistics that keep the army going. And the minute you threaten the logistics, you threaten the army, because it's all connected and it all relies on the logistic supply lines.
Excellent, thank you, Peter. I do have a couple of things I want to add. It is kind of closing time, but first of all, the Telegram channel of the mayor of Moscow, his personal blog, has been hacked by Ukrainian hackers, and is currently advertising the Ukrainian military fundraiser. And also it says here, Moscow will burn, and that just keeps repeating over and over again. There was another one that kept repeating, you Russian, dirty word, I donated to the drones. So it looks as though that continued for some time and then had to be banned to stop the flow of Ukrainian messages. So never mind, eh? Now, it turns out that the Russians have also complained that Belarus have jammed a Russian operator called MTS. And now the Russians are not able to use those relays on the territory of the Republic of Belarus. Oh dear.
Following Zelensky's threats, which implies that the Belarusians are taking Zelensky seriously, as indeed they should.
Yeah, as indeed they should. And just a couple more things. There was restrictions now introduced in Crimea. So Crimea now has a bedtime, a curfew of 8 p.m, at which point street lighting will be switched off, which is, just, I'm just going to say that all sorts of nefarious things can happen in the dark. Just saying. And we also have this 60,000 new logistics drones, or sorry, anti-logistics drones, have arrived from Germany in Ukraine. Just 60,000 new drones have been delivered from Germany. So just to let you know that many drones have now arrived, and they had a display of all these boxes and boxes and boxes of all these drones. So just in case you were thinking of delivering any logistics through that road corridor to Crimea, you maybe don't want to. And on that happy note, I think we're good. We're good to go, because, I need to go put myself to bed shortly because, I've got to go up early. You know how these things work. So I love yous and I mean it, but I think we're going to do one. Yeah.
Yep, that's fair enough. I've enjoyed tonight. I hope all our listeners have enjoyed it and found it useful. Once again, I sort of, this is all kind of, sort of fairly basic stuff to me, but it's not to everybody else who's not sort of got railways on the brain and what have you. So thanks very much for listening. I hope to do another one fairly soon. I'll try and sort of try to do one as soon as there's any major developments or changes. Shall we go to TKD Bach just quickly before we close?
Thank you. This was excellent. I just wanted to ask real quickly if we knew yet when our next segment was going to be.
We don't know, but if we aim for something like roughly 2 weeks, if you keep an eye on the space announcements, then hopefully we'll do one, something like that. And if anything amazing happens in the coming week, then maybe we'll do one sooner. It depends on sort of diaries and what other spaces are up and various things. But I'll try and make myself available when there's any major sort of logistical or major developments. And certainly in the last few weeks and months, there have been incredible developments in the last months and amazing developments in the last week or two, both in St. Petersburg and Moscow. And was it last night or the night before last in Tyumen? Quite astonishing, really. The whole thing is it's by far the most upbeat I've been in the last 2-3 years, because the last 2-3 years, as many of you know here, have been pretty tough. So it's very good to see things finally turning the corner and the Ukrainians doing what they should have done, been able to do many years ago. But there we are, better late than never. Anyway, I'm gonna log off, I think, and say thanks very much. And thanks for joining us. And of course, Slava Ukraini.
Heroim Slava.
Slava Nazi.
Smed Varaham. And thank you very much, host phone chap. You can now kill it with fire. Thank you.
Pobachimus.
Pobachimus.